A routine traffic stop quickly turns tense as the officer sizes up the driver, making assumptions based on race. But when he realizes who he's pulled over, everything he thought he knew shatters. Will he admit his mistake, or let his prejudices control the moment? It was daytime, the sun high in the sky casting long shadows across the road. The black driver was making their way home, not in a rush, just heading down a quiet street, thinking about the day. But that calm was shattered by the sudden flash of red and blue lights in the rearview mirror. The driver took a deep breath. They knew the drill. Hands on the wheel.
Stay calm.
Don't make any sudden moves. The officer approached the car slowly, his boots making soft sounds against the pavement. His face was hard to read, but the tension in his steps was clear. He was one of those officers, the kind who always seemed to approach a traffic stop with suspicion. The driver could tell. It wasn't the first time. License and registration. The officer barked, his voice firm, a little colder than necessary. The driver kept their hands where they could see them, their voice calm as they responded. Sure, officer. There was something about the way the officer stood there, looking down at them, something that made the air feel thicker. Was it the time of day? The way the officer was scanning them with a stare that felt colder than the midday sun? Or maybe it was just the weight of everything else. The tension that existed between people of different backgrounds and law enforcement. The officer didn't seem to be in a hurry. He took his time, glancing at the driver and then back to the paperwork. The seconds ticked by slowly. The driver's heart raced, but they kept their face steady. What's the problem, officer? The driver asked, trying to break the silence. The officer didn't answer immediately, eyes narrowing, studying the driver. There was a hesitation in the way he responded. You were speeding back there. License and registration. It was a lie. The driver hadn't been speeding. But it wasn't worth arguing. The officer's eyes lingered on the driver's face as he handed over the paperwork. It wasn't just the usual scan. This time, there was something in his eyes, something judgmental. The driver felt it. They'd felt it before. The officer walked back to his car, the silence between them growing heavier. Back in his car, the officer stared at the screen in front of him, typing in the driver's information. He was a man who had seen it all, or so he thought. There was something about this driver, though, something that made him pause. The name didn't seem to register at first. But then, the officer's fingers froze. He double-checked the name on the screen, squinting, still not fully believing it. Could it be? The officer's thoughts started racing. A name that seemed familiar, too familiar. A well-known figure, but one who, in the officer's mind, didn't fit the image he had painted of them. He had been expecting someone who matched his assumptions, not someone who had walked down a different path. But the doubts kept creeping in. The driver's calm, collected demeanor didn't fit with what the officer had expected. That calmness in the face of everything, the way they hadn't flinched, hadn't raised their voice, hadn't made any sudden movements, wasn't what the officer had anticipated from someone who, in his mind, might have been guilty of something. Still, the officer didn't rush. He knew he had to check the details. If this was who he thought it was, it might be awkward, but it was better to be sure. The officer stayed in his car a moment longer, thoughts swirling. The officer walked back to the car, now with a noticeable pause in his step, a shift in his energy. As he got closer, the driver remained still, almost as if they knew what was coming. They didn't move or fidget. They were still as stone. I just need to confirm something, the officer said, his voice wavering slightly, more cautious now. The driver's eyes met his, and there was a quiet moment. No words exchanged, just the silent understanding that something was about to change. The officer cleared his throat. Are you really who I think you are? The driver didn't speak right away. For a second, it almost felt like the tension would snap in a way neither of them had expected. Finally, the driver spoke.
Yes.
That's me, they said, calm as ever. The officer stood frozen, a slight heat rising to his face. The realization hit him hard. He had just pulled over someone important, someone highly respected, someone who had achieved far more than he could ever imagine. The officer felt the weight of his own assumptions crash down on him. His mouth went dry. The driver didn't give him the satisfaction of confrontation, didn't push him. Instead, the driver simply sat there, waiting. They didn't need to say more. The officer had already realized the mistake. The officer's face flushed with embarrassment. He had assumed. He had judged. And now, he could feel the shame of it, creeping up on him like a slow tide.
I'm
sorry, the officer said, his voice quiet but genuine, the weight of his mistake hanging in the air. The driver didn't respond immediately. They kept their gaze steady, calm. The words hung between them, suspended in the quiet of the moment. The apology wasn't for show. The officer's realization was real, and the apology carried weight. There was no need for further words. The officer had seen the truth, and the driver didn't need to say anything else. "You're free to go," the officer said, almost to himself, nodding slightly. The driver didn't hesitate. They started the car, gave the officer a final glance, and drove off into the day. The officer watched them go, standing there for a moment longer than necessary. There was nothing else to say. The encounter had ended, but it had changed something inside him. He couldn't forget the lesson, and for the first time in a long while, he wondered how many other people he had judged before giving them the benefit of the doubt. As the officer walked back to his patrol car, he could feel the weight of what had just happened. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic apology, just the slow realization that assumptions were dangerous, and they could be costly. He sat down in his car, staring out into the sunlight, lost in thought. Maybe he would think twice next time. Maybe, just maybe, people weren't always what they seemed on the surface. Maybe there was a lesson to be learned, even on bright, ordinary days. The sound of his radio crackled, but the officer didn't reach for it right away. For once, the usual noise of the world outside felt far away. What had happened wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It was a moment of change, a small but important shift in his view of the world. And for the first time in a long while, he wondered if things could really be different. If people could really be seen for who they truly were. How would you feel if you were the officer, realizing your mistake in that moment? Or the driver, staying calm despite it all? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about breaking down these assumptions and creating real change. How would you feel if you were the officer, realizing your mistake in that moment? Or the driver, staying calm despite it all? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss how we can challenge our assumptions and create real change, one story at a time. Subscribe to our channel for soul-stirring stories.